For 30 years, salt was part of every meal, every memory, every habit that felt harmless. When he finally cut back, it wasn't fear or a diagnosis that guided him, but a quieter realization about control, clarity, and how small choices shape dignity as the years advance. He had never thought of salt as something he chose. It was simply there, the way the table was there, the way the chair fit his body without thought, the way certain habits settle into a life so deeply that they stop asking permission. For more than 30 years, salt had lived quietly at the center of his meals, scattered across eggs in the morning, folded into soups in the afternoon, pressed gently into meat and vegetables at night. It was not indulgence. It was familiarity. It was how food tasted like food. When he thought back, he could not remember a moment when salt entered his life with intention. There was no decision point, no conscious adoption. It came with inheritance. With childhood kitchens where meals were cooked the same way every day, with hands that moved automatically, seasoning by feel, never by measure. His mother salted without looking. His father added more at the table before even tasting. That was not carelessness. That was culture. That was home. Salt was not excess to him. It was comfort. As a boy, he learned that certain flavors meant safety. The smell of dinner drifting through the house in the early evening. The sound of utensils against plates. The quiet relief of sitting down after a long day, knowing that whatever else had gone wrong, there would be something warm and familiar waiting. Salt was part of that assurance. It made simple ingredients feel complete. It filled in gaps. It made things feel finished. Over time, that association deepened. Food, seasoned the way he expected it to be seasoned, did more than satisfy hunger. It steadied him. It told him that the world, at least in this small way, was still predictable. When he left home and began cooking for himself, he carried those expectations with him. He did not question them. He recreated what he knew. Meals were not experiments. They were continuations. Each dish echoed something older, something learned by watching rather than being taught. Salt went in early. Salt went in again at the end. It was instinctive, like tying his shoes. As the years passed, his life grew more complex. Work demanded attention. Family responsibilities layered themselves onto his days. Time became something to manage carefully. Meals shifted from long, lingering affairs to practical necessities squeezed between obligations. But even then, salt remained a constant. A small certainty in days that often felt crowded. Cooking became less about creativity and more about grounding. He made the same dishes over and over, not because he lacked imagination, but because repetition offered rest. When so much of life required decision-making, familiarity was a relief. Knowing exactly how something would taste saved energy. It reduced friction. It allowed him to move through the day without stopping to reconsider every detail. Salt helped with that. There is something deeply human about the way habits attach themselves to comfort. We rarely notice them forming. They grow quietly, fed by repetition and reassurance. Over time, they stop feeling like choices at all. They become part of the environment, like background noise we only notice when it disappears. For him, salt was woven into memory as much as into food. Certain meals brought back specific moments without effort. The stew reminded him of winters when the house felt smaller but warmer. A simple piece of bread with butter and salt carried him back to early mornings before school. These associations were not sentimental in a dramatic way. They were subtle, steady, reliable. As he aged, the world around him changed. Language shifted, technology advanced, social rhythms altered, but his kitchen remained familiar. The same drawer held the same utensils, the same spices sat in the same places. Salt stayed within reach, easy to find without looking. That continuity mattered more than he realized. When people talk about aging, they often focus on loss of strength, loss of speed, loss of certainty, but aging also brings a quiet narrowing of what feels safe. With each year, the body asks for more consideration. Energy becomes something to conserve. Too much novelty can feel exhausting rather than exciting. Familiarity becomes a kind of shelter. Salt lived inside that shelter. It made meals predictable. It ensured that food would meet expectation. It prevented disappointment in moments when patience was already thin. After a long day, he did not want to be surprised by his dinner. He wanted it to taste the way it always had. There was dignity in that desire. Wanting comfort is not weakness, it is wisdom learned through experience. When life has already asked you to adapt many times, it makes sense to protect the areas where you do not have to. Salt became one of those protected areas. He never thought of himself as someone who overdid anything. He did not drink excessively. He did not indulge recklessly. He lived within reasonable bounds. Salt to him was not indulgence. It was baseline. It was what made food feel honest. When conversations arose about nutrition or moderation, he listened politely but without urgency. Those discussions always seemed abstract, aimed at someone else. He felt fine. He functioned well. He woke up each morning and moved through his day without issue. There was no alarm demanding his attention, and so the habit remained unexamined. Over decades, repetition builds authority. When something has been done the same way for a long time without apparent consequence, it begins to feel justified. The absence of immediate problems becomes evidence. The habit proves itself simply by continuing. Salt had proven itself in his life. It was there when he cooked for his children, teaching them by example what food was supposed to taste like. It was there during holidays, scattered generously over dishes meant to bring people together. It was there in quiet evenings when he cooked just for himself, finding comfort in routine after others had gone their separate ways. Each time, salt played its role without calling attention to itself. He did not measure. He did not count. He seasoned by feel, by memory, by habit. His hand moved the way it always had. The action required no thought. It was as natural as breathing. There is a particular kind of invisibility that comes with long-standing habits. They disappear not because they are hidden, but because they are too familiar to stand out. They become part of the structure of daily life, supporting it quietly from beneath. This invisibility can feel like peace. For him, salt was not just an ingredient. It was a symbol of continuity. It linked his present self to his past without effort. It allowed him to feel rooted in a life that had changed in many other ways. As his body aged, certain adjustments became necessary. He moved a little slower. He rested more intentionally. He became more selective about how he spent his energy. These changes were accepted with grace. They felt natural, even respectful. Aging was not an enemy to him. It was a process he moved through thoughtfully. Salt did not feel like something that needed adjustment. Because habits that feel like home rarely raise questions, questioning them can feel like questioning the foundation itself. And foundations, by their nature, are meant to be trusted. There was also pride woven into the habit. He knew how to cook. He had fed himself and others for decades. His meals were dependable. People enjoyed them. Compliments came easily. No one pushed plates away. No one asked for less seasoning. That reinforcement mattered. It affirmed that his way was not just familiar to him, but acceptable to others. In a world where many older adults begin to feel subtly sidelined, losing confidence in their relevance, these small affirmations carry weight. Being competent in the kitchen, being able to produce something others enjoy, reinforces a sense of usefulness and identity. Salt supported that sense quietly. When life narrows in certain ways, people hold on to what still feels solid. They protect routines that affirm capability. They resist unnecessary changes, not out of stubbornness, but out of self-respect. His salt habit lived inside that dynamic. It is easy from the outside to label such habits as automatic or unthinking. But from within, they feel earned. They feel like the result of years of living, learning, and refining what works. To question them can feel like undoing hard-won stability. So he did not question. Years folded into each other. Meals passed quietly. The habit continued, untouched by scrutiny. Salt remained part of the furniture of his life, as ordinary and unquestioned as the walls around him. And in that ordinariness, something important was happening. Not harm, not excess, but distance. Distance from awareness, distance from choice. Not because he was incapable of choosing, but because choosing had long ago been replaced by continuity. At this stage of his life, that felt reasonable. He had already navigated enough change. He had adapted to losses and transitions that demanded real emotional work. Compared to those, altering a long-standing habit around food felt unnecessary, even disrespectful to the life he had built. Salt was part of his story. It represented meals shared, years past, care given and care received. It was not a villain. It was a companion, one that had been with him quietly for decades, never demanding attention, never causing disruption. And so, for a long time, he allowed it to remain exactly where it was. Not because he was unaware, not because he was careless, but because some habits feel less like behaviors and more like belonging. And belonging, especially later in life, is something people guard carefully. That was the place salt held in his world. It felt like home. For most of his life, questioning what worked felt unnecessary. Trust had been built slowly, over years of experience that reinforced a simple belief. If something had carried you this far, it deserved to be left alone. Salt was part of that larger pattern. It belonged to a way of living shaped by reliability rather than analysis, by doing rather than debating. He came from a generation that learned by watching. Instructions were rarely explained in detail. You observed, you repeated, and eventually you understood. Authority did not need to justify itself constantly. If someone older showed you how something was done, that knowledge carried weight. You didn't dismantle it piece by piece. You accepted it as a whole. Food followed the same logic. Meals were prepared the way they had always been prepared. Recipes were not written down so much as absorbed. Flavor came from instinct, from knowing how something was supposed to taste rather than from following exact measurements. Salt, in this context, was not an ingredient to be controlled. It was a tool of balance, applied with confidence and trust in one's own judgment. That trust extended beyond the kitchen. As he grew older, he learned to respect systems that functioned smoothly. Workplaces had hierarchies for a reason. Communities ran on shared expectations. Routines existed to keep things moving without friction. Questioning every detail felt inefficient, even disruptive. There was wisdom, he believed, in letting well-established processes do their work. This outlook served him well. He showed up when he was supposed to. He followed instructions. He fulfilled responsibilities without complaint. Over time, this approach built a life that felt stable and respectable. He did not seek control over everything. He trusted that some things could be handled by systems larger than himself. Salt fit neatly into that worldview. It was part of a broader trust in continuity. His parents had cooked this way. Their parents before them likely did the same. The food had sustained generations. No one he knew had stopped to question it seriously. That absence of doubt was reassuring. It suggested that the habit was safe, tested by time. He never saw himself as someone who resisted change. He adapted when necessary. He learned new skills when work demanded it. He accepted shifts in family roles as children grew and moved on. But he also knew the difference between necessary change and optional disruption. Salt felt optional to examine, not necessary. There is a subtle difference between curiosity and responsibility. In his mind, responsibility meant handling what truly mattered, providing, caring, showing up for others. Curiosity, especially about everyday habits that cause no visible harm, felt like a luxury, something for people with excess time or energy. As the years went on, life asked more of him in quieter ways. Energy became something to budget. Attention became selective. He learned where to invest effort and where to let things run on autopilot. This was not avoidance. It was survival through simplification. Salt lived comfortably on autopilot. He trusted his body's feedback. He trusted his appetite. He trusted the absence of obvious consequences. Day after day, he felt capable. He did not wake up with concerns tied to food. He did not experience moments that demanded re-evaluation. Everything functioned well enough. In a culture increasingly filled with conflicting advice, that stability felt precious. Over time, he noticed how often recommendations changed. One year something was praised, the next year discouraged. Headlines shifted. Opinions contradicted one another. For someone who had already lived through decades of evolving guidance, it was easy to feel skeptical. If advice was always changing, why chase it? He had learned to value consistency over novelty. He trusted what endured rather than what fluctuated. Salt, steady and uncontroversial in his daily life, felt like a constant in a noisy world. There was also an emotional layer to this trust. Food was one of the few pleasures that remained reliably accessible. As the body ages, some joys require more effort. Travel becomes tiring. Late nights lose their appeal. Physical stamina changes. Food, however, remains close at hand. It offers comfort without demanding much in return. To question something that brought daily satisfaction felt unnecessary, even ungrateful. He also noticed how often older adults are spoken to rather than listened to. Advice is offered freely, sometimes without context, sometimes without respect for lived experience. Over time, this can make people resistant to new information, not because it lacks merit, but because it feels dismissive of everything that came before. He did not want to feel corrected by life. Trusting what had always worked became a way of maintaining dignity. It allowed him to feel grounded in his own experience rather than constantly adjusting to external expectations. Salt, once again, symbolized something larger than itself. It represented self-reliance. He had fed himself and others successfully for decades. That success mattered. It proved competence. It confirmed that he knew how to care for himself. Questioning that competence could feel like undermining it. So he didn't. Even when conversations around moderation surfaced casually, he treated them with a polite distance. He listened without engagement, not because he was close-minded, but because he saw no pressing reason to open that door. Life already demanded enough reflection. There is also comfort in believing that some choices no longer need revisiting. In later years, people often long for areas of life that feel settled, places where decisions are already made and do not need to be reopened. This sense of completion can bring peace. Salt lived in that completed space. It was part of a set of assumptions that allowed him to move through the day without friction. He trusted that if something truly required his attention, it would announce itself clearly. Until then, there was no need to disturb the balance. This belief was not careless. It was cautious in its own way. He avoided unnecessary worry. He preserved mental space for relationships, for reflection, for rest. He understood that attention is finite, and he chose carefully where to place it. Salt did not feel deserving of attention. Looking back, he can see how this trust shaped his relationship with choice. Decisions made long ago were allowed to continue indefinitely. They carried forward on momentum rather than intention. This was not neglect. It was efficiency, refined over years of experience, but momentum has its own character. When something continues without being revisited, it becomes less about choice and more about assumption. The original reasons fade. What remains is habit, reinforced by time. At the time, this felt like wisdom. He had seen people chase every new idea, constantly changing direction, never settling. That kind of restlessness seemed exhausting. He preferred steadiness. He preferred a life that moved forward without constant revision. Salt aligned with that preference perfectly. It stayed the same while the world shifted. It asked nothing of him. It allowed him to focus elsewhere. In a life increasingly filled with transitions, that consistency was comforting. Trusting what had always worked allowed him to feel anchored. Only much later would he recognize that trust and awareness are not the same thing. That something can work and still deserve attention. That familiarity can coexist with reflection. But at this stage of his life, he was not there yet. He moved through his days confident in the choices already made, content to let well-worn paths carry him forward. Salt remained part of that path, unquestioned, reliable, and quietly affirmed by time. The trust was sincere, and because it felt earned, it went unexamined. The moment did not arrive with urgency. There was no warning, no discomfort sharp enough to demand attention, no external voice telling him that something needed to change. It came quietly, almost unnoticed at first, woven into an ordinary day that looked no different from the hundreds before it. He was standing in his kitchen preparing a meal he had made countless times. The movements were familiar, almost rhythmic, ingredients laid out in their usual places, pan heating slowly, the room filled with a scent he recognized immediately, one that carried no surprises. He reached for the salt without thinking, and then, for reasons he could not immediately explain, his hand slowed. It wasn't confusion. He knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't forgetfulness either. His routine was intact, clear in his mind. What interrupted the motion was something more subtle, a pause that seemed to come from a place beneath thought. His fingers hovered over the container for a moment longer than usual. In that brief space, nothing dramatic happened. The world did not shift. The room did not feel different. But inside him, attention stirred. Not alarm, not doubt, just noticing. He became aware, perhaps for the first time in a long while, of the act itself. The reaching, the shaking, the certainty that followed. He noticed how automatic it was, how completely his body had taken over without consulting his awareness. He stood there, salt still in hand, and felt a quiet curiosity rise. Why had he never really thought about this before? The question did not feel accusatory. It carried no judgment. It was gentle, almost conversational, as if a part of him had simply decided to speak after years of silence. He set the salt down. That alone felt unusual. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. He had interrupted a flow that had carried him for decades. He did not replace it with a new action right away. He simply stood there, noticing the absence of movement. The kitchen was quiet. No one else was there. No one was waiting for the meal to be finished at a particular time. For once, there was no external pressure to continue. He realized how rare moments like this had become. Most days moved quickly, even now. Even in later life, time seemed to pass without pause. Routines filled the hours. Tasks followed one another. There was comfort in that rhythm, but also a certain narrowing. Moments of pure attention without agenda, had grown scarce. This moment offered one. He leaned slightly against the counter, allowing himself to remain still. The food continued to cook quietly. Nothing was being lost by waiting. As he stood there, he noticed how his body felt. Not in a clinical way, not with concern, just awareness, the weight of his feet on the floor, the steady rise and fall of his breath, the familiarity of the space around him. And then, something else surfaced. He realized that this pause was not really about salt. It was about how long it had been since he had looked closely at something he did every day. For years he had lived inside habits that required no reflection. They carried him forward efficiently, reliably. But efficiency has a cost. It narrows awareness. It encourages movement without presence. This pause cracked that pattern, just slightly. He thought about how often he moved through his day without really seeing what he was doing, how many actions were guided by memory rather than intention, how many choices were no longer choices at all, but inherited motions repeated without question. This recognition did not feel heavy. It felt clear. He remembered other moments, scattered across the past year, that now seemed connected. Times when he had felt a slight distance from himself. Not confusion, not decline, just the softness at the edges of attention. A word that took a little longer to come. A thought that drifted away before fully forming. He had dismissed those moments easily. Aging brings changes, and he had accepted that with grace. He did not expect his mind to feel exactly as it had decades earlier. He had earned the right to slow down, but standing there now, he wondered whether slowing down had quietly turned into stepping back. The question surprised him. He had never thought of himself as disengaged. He still cared deeply about his life. He followed conversations, he maintained relationships, he took pride in staying informed and involved. But perhaps there were areas where he had allowed awareness to fade simply because it was easier. Salt was one of those areas. The act of seasoning food had become so automatic that it no longer passed through conscious choice. It happened without consultation, without pause, without presence. This realization did not provoke guilt. It provoked curiosity. What else in his life had followed the same path? He did not try to answer that immediately. He allowed the question to sit beside him unhurried. The power of the moment was not in solving anything, but in noticing. He tasted the food without adding salt. That too felt unfamiliar, not unpleasant, just different. The flavor was quieter, more subtle. It asked more of his attention. He noticed himself chewing more slowly. This was not a judgment. It was an observation. He was present in a way he had not been moments before. The experience felt grounded, deliberate. As he stood there, another thought surfaced. For most of his life he had believed that change announced itself clearly, that if something truly needed attention, it would arrive with discomfort or disruption, pain, urgency, a reason too loud to ignore. But this moment challenged that belief. Nothing hurt, nothing was wrong. And yet, something meaningful was happening. He began to understand that reflection does not always begin with problems. Sometimes it begins with clarity, with the realization that just because something has worked does not mean it no longer deserves attention. This pause had not been forced upon him. He had allowed it. That distinction mattered. He thought about how often older adults are told to simplify, to reduce effort, to let go of unnecessary thinking. There is wisdom in that advice, but also risk. Simplification can easily slide into disengagement if it is not balanced with awareness. Standing in his kitchen, he felt that balance shift slightly. He was not rejecting his routine, he was looking at it. The food finished cooking. He plated it slowly, deliberately. Each movement carried awareness now, not because he was trying to be mindful in any formal sense, but because his attention had been awakened. He sat down to eat and noticed how the room felt. The light, the quiet, the familiarity that had always been there now seen more clearly. He ate without adding salt. The meal was still satisfying. Different but not lacking. That surprised him. As he ate, he realized something else. This pause had given him a sense of space. Space to notice, space to choose, space that had been absent, not because it was unavailable, but because he had not invited it. The invitation had been simple, a slowed hand, a moment of curiosity. That was all it took. After the meal, he cleaned up as usual. The routine resumed, but it did not feel quite the same. There was a subtle shift beneath the surface. The actions were familiar, but his relationship to them had changed. He was aware. This awareness did not demand immediate action. It did not insist that he change everything. It simply remained present, like a quiet companion. He found himself thinking about that pause later in the day. Not with urgency, but with interest. It felt important in a way that was hard to define. He realized that moments like this often go unnoticed because they do not demand attention. They do not interrupt life loudly. They whisper. Most people miss them. He had almost missed this one. But once awareness enters, it rarely leaves quietly. It settles in, asking gentle questions, offering clarity without pressure. By the end of the day, he knew that something had shifted. Not his habits, not yet. His attention. And attention, he would soon discover, has a way of leading us forward, one quiet moment at a time. In the days that followed, he did not rush to make sense of what had happened. The pause lingered with him, not as a problem to solve, but as a presence. It accompanied him through ordinary moments, resurfacing quietly as he moved through routines that once felt entirely automatic. He noticed how often his attention drifted away from his actions, how easily familiarity carried him forward without reflection. This awareness was not uncomfortable. It was steady, almost reassuring. At first, he assumed the moment in the kitchen had been about food alone. Salt, taste, habit. But as time passed, it became clear that something deeper had been touched. The pause had opened a door he had not known was there, leading not outward, but inward. He began to observe himself more closely, not with scrutiny or judgment, but with interest. He paid attention to how his mind moved through the day, how thoughts formed, how easily they connected or didn't. He noticed the texture of his mornings, the way clarity arrived or lagged as the day unfolded. These observations did not alarm him. They informed him. For many years he had accepted certain changes as natural companions of aging, a slower recall, a softer edge to concentration, the tendency to tire more quickly when conversations grew dense. He had welcomed these shifts with acceptance rather than resistance. Life, after all, had given him many full decades. He did not expect his experience to remain unchanged, but now, with this renewed attention, he wondered whether all of those changes belonged solely to time. This wondering was not suspicion, it was care. He thought about the value he placed on clarity, not sharpness in the youthful sense, but presence. The ability to follow a thought through to its end, to feel connected to conversations, to recognize himself in his own responses. These qualities mattered to him more now than they ever had before. As he reflected, he realized that his decision to examine his relationship with salt was not motivated by fear of illness or concern over numbers. He had not been driven by external advice or warnings. The impulse had come from within, guided by a desire to remain present in his own life. This distinction was important. He had spent years responding responsibly to external demands, work, family, obligations. Now he was responding to something quieter, an internal request for clarity. Salt, in this context, became symbolic. It represented a habit that had outlived its original purpose without being re-examined. It had supported him for years, yes, but perhaps its role deserved a fresh look, not because it was wrong, but because he was no longer the same person who had adopted it. Time changes people in ways that are easy to overlook. The body shifts, the mind matures, priorities reorder themselves quietly. What once felt necessary can become excessive. What once felt harmless can become simply unnecessary. These changes are not failures of judgment. They are signs of evolution. He began to see that reducing salt was not about restricting pleasure. It was about aligning his habits with who he was now. This realization brought a sense of calm. There was no urgency pushing him to act immediately, no rules to follow, no outcomes to chase. He was not seeking improvement in a measurable sense. He was seeking congruence between his habits and his values, between his daily actions and his desire for presence. He noticed how deeply he valued independence, not the loud, defiant kind, but the quiet form that lives in small choices. Choosing when to rest. Choosing what to eat. Choosing how to spend time. These decisions, modest as they may seem, formed the backbone of his dignity. Over time, he had noticed how easily such choices can shrink, not taken away forcefully, but softened through convenience. Assumptions replace decisions. Momentum replaces intention. Reviewing his use of salt became a way of reclaiming that intention. He began experimenting gently, without fanfare. Some meals he added less, some he added none. He noticed the difference without rushing to judge it. Taste changed. His awareness sharpened. He found himself paying closer attention to flavors he had once overlooked. This was not discipline, it was curiosity. He realized how rarely he had allowed himself to be curious about his own routines. Curiosity had been reserved for the world outside news, ideas, conversations. Now it turned inward, illuminating areas of his life that had long been taken for granted. As this curiosity grew, so did his sense of agency. He was not changing his habits because he had to. He was changing them because he wanted to understand them. That understanding brought with it a quiet confidence. He felt less like a passenger in his own routines and more like a participant. This shift extended beyond food. He noticed how often he chose convenience over engagement in other areas as well. How easily he accepted assumptions about what aging meant. How readily he stepped back rather than leaning in. None of this felt like loss. It felt like opportunity. He began to see aging not as a narrowing path, but as a different landscape, one that required attention rather than speed. In this landscape, clarity mattered more than accumulation. Presence mattered more than habit. Salt was simply the entry point. He thought about how many people equate health-focused changes with fear, with reaction, with surrender, but what he was experiencing felt like the opposite. It felt like respect for his body, for his mind, for the life he was still actively living. This respect did not demand perfection. It asked for honesty. Honesty about what still served him. Honesty about what no longer did. Honesty about his desire to remain engaged with his own experience. As days turned into weeks, he felt more attuned to himself. Not dramatically different, but subtly steadier. His thoughts felt less scattered. His attention lingered longer. Conversations felt more grounded. He did not attribute these changes to salt alone. He understood that awareness itself carries power. When attention returns to an area long neglected, it often brings clarity simply by being present. This reinforced his understanding. The real reason he had cut back on salt was not health alone. It was alignment. It was a quiet commitment to remain connected to himself as his life continued to unfold. This commitment felt deeply personal. He did not share it widely. There was no need. It was not a statement or a lesson. It was a relationship between him and his own awareness. In making the shift, he felt something settle inside him, a sense of rightness, not because he had changed something specific, but because he had listened. Listening, he realized, was a form of care, and care, when directed inward, has the power to clarify not just what we do, but why we do it. That understanding marked a turning point, not one that demanded transformation, but one that opened space. Space for gentler choices, space for continued presence, space for dignity rooted in awareness rather than habit. He had not lost anything by reducing salt. He had gained something quieter and far more valuable: clarity. And with that clarity came a readiness to move forward, not by rejecting comfort, but by choosing it with intention. He did not approach the change with force. There was no declaration, no rigid rule placed upon himself, no attempt to undo 30 years of habit overnight. The awareness he had gained asked for something gentler than that. It asked for balance. He understood, perhaps more clearly now than ever before, that comfort and awareness do not have to stand in opposition. Too often, change is framed as lossless flavor, less pleasure, less ease. But what he was discovering felt different. It felt like refinement rather than removal. He still cooked the meals he loved. He still returned to the dishes that had carried him through different chapters of his life. What changed was not the menu, but the manner. He slowed down. He tasted more carefully. He added salt with intention rather than reflex. Sometimes he still added it at the table. That choice mattered. It reminded him that he was not denying himself, only deciding. This distinction became important to him. For years he had associated moderation with restriction and restriction with punishment. That way of thinking had never appealed to him. He had lived long enough to know that harsh rules rarely endure. They exhaust the spirit and eventually give way to resentment. What he wanted now was something sustainable, something that respected both his history and his present needs. He noticed how his body responded to this gentler approach, not dramatically, not in ways that demanded interpretation, just a sense of ease. Meals felt lighter, not in substance, but in how they sat with him. He did not feel dulled afterward. He felt present. This presence extended beyond the table. Because he was paying closer attention while cooking and eating, he found himself more attentive in other parts of his day as well. He listened more fully during conversations. He noticed when his energy dipped and responded with rest rather than frustration. He began to treat his attention as something worth protecting. The change was subtle, but it was real. He realized how often comfort is misunderstood. Comfort is not indulgence. It is a state of ease that allows us to remain engaged with life. When comfort turns into numbness, it loses its value. When it is chosen consciously, it becomes supportive. By choosing awareness, he had not lost comfort. He had deepened it. He also noticed something else. By letting go of extremes, he avoided the inner conflict that so often accompanies change. There was no voice inside him arguing that he was being deprived. No sense of discipline battling desire. The choice felt calm. This calm mattered. At this stage of life, peace had become more important than progress. He was no longer interested in optimizing himself. He wanted to live in a way that felt steady, grounded, and honest. Reducing salt without erasing it fit that aim perfectly. He reflected on how often people are encouraged to make sweeping changes when smaller adjustments would suffice. There is a cultural tendency to frame health and aging as battles to be fought. He had never resonated with that language. Life, as he experienced it now, was not something to conquer. It was something to accompany. This shift in perspective shaped how he approached his days. He gave himself permission to adjust slowly, to notice without pressure, to return to old habits when they still felt right, and to let them soften when they no longer did. He found that food tasted different when eaten with attention. Flavors that had once been masked by salt began to emerge. Herbs felt brighter. Natural sweetness came forward. He did not feel like he was discovering something new so much as rediscovering what had always been there. That rediscovery brought quiet satisfaction. He realized that this was what balance looked like in practice. Not a rigid midpoint, but a living relationship with choice. One that allowed for flexibility, forgiveness, and honesty. There were days when he added more salt. He did not criticize himself for it. He understood that habits built over decades do not disappear completely, nor should they. They are part of who we are. What mattered was that those habits were no longer invisible. By keeping awareness present, he remained engaged. He stayed connected to his actions rather than drifting through them. That connection gave him a sense of dignity that had nothing to do with perfection. He thought about how many changes in later life are framed as losses. Loss of strength, loss of speed, loss of independence. But this change felt like a gain, not in control, but in relationship with himself. He was not trying to be someone else. He was trying to be more fully himself as he was now. This approach required patience. Patience with old instincts. Patience with moments of forgetfulness. Patience with the natural rhythm of change. Fortunately, patience was something life had already taught him. He carried that patience into the kitchen, into his meals, into his days. The result was not a sense of restraint, but of alignment. His habits began to reflect his values more clearly. He valued clarity, presence, and ease. His choices started to support those values without drama. In choosing awareness without losing comfort, he found a middle ground that felt deeply respectful. Respectful of the life he had lived. Respectful of the body he inhabited now. Respectful of the years still unfolding ahead of him. This was not a transformation that demanded recognition from others. It was quiet, personal, and inward. But it mattered, because through this gentle adjustment, he had learned something enduring. Change does not have to be disruptive to be meaningful. It can be calm. It can be kind. It can move at the pace of understanding rather than urgency. And when it does, it leaves room for peace. That peace stayed with him as he continued forward, carrying both familiarity and awareness together, no longer in conflict, but in conversation. What surprised him most was not what changed, but what remained. Life did not become dramatically different after he cut back on salt. His days still unfolded in familiar ways. He woke at the same time. He moved through the same rooms. He cooked many of the same meals. From the outside, very little appeared altered, and yet something essential had shifted beneath the surface. He felt more present inside his own life. This presence was not constant or intense. It did not announce itself loudly. It showed up quietly, in small moments. In the way he noticed the light in the kitchen as he prepared a meal. In how he listened without distraction when someone spoke. In how he sensed his own limits and responded with care rather than impatience. The change had given him authorship. For years, habits had carried him forward. They had served him well, but now awareness walked beside them. He was no longer moving purely on momentum. He was choosing, even when the choice was to continue as before. That choice mattered more than the action itself. He realized that what he had gained was not control in the rigid sense. He was not managing every detail of his life. He was not striving for perfection or mastery. What he had gained was participation. He was actively involved in his own experience again. This involvement brought a quiet confidence. He felt less like someone to whom things simply happened, and more like someone who was still shaping his days. Not dramatically, not forcefully, but thoughtfully. This sense of authorship extended into other areas of his life as well. He found himself asking gentle questions where he once accepted assumptions. Not in a confrontational way, but with curiosity. Why do I do this? Does this still serve me? Is this something I want to continue, or simply something I've always done? Often the answer was to continue, and that was fine. The act of choosing made continuation feel intentional rather than automatic. There was peace in that. He noticed how this awareness softened his relationship with aging itself. Aging no longer felt like something happening to him. It felt like something he was living through consciously. Each stage carried its own rhythm, its own needs, its own forms of wisdom. He no longer saw reflection as something reserved for moments of crisis. It became a natural part of daily life, a way of staying connected rather than correcting. This shift changed how he viewed dignity. Dignity, he realized, is not only about independence or strength, it is about presence. About being engaged with one's own life, even as it changes, about honoring the ability to notice, to choose, to understand. By paying attention to something as ordinary as salt, he had reconnected with that dignity. The irony did not escape him. For decades, salt had been part of his life without question, and now, by simply noticing it, he had opened a doorway to something much larger. Awareness had spilled outward, touching other habits, other assumptions, other quiet areas of his life. He had not become more rigid, he had become more flexible, because awareness, when held gently, does not confine. It expands. He also noticed a deepened sense of calm, not because all questions had been answered, but because questions were no longer feared. He had learned that looking closely did not destabilize his life, it steadied it. This understanding stayed with him. When he spoke with friends, he listened for moments when they mentioned feeling slightly disconnected or dulled. He did not offer advice. He did not suggest changes. He understood now that awareness cannot be imposed. It must be invited. Instead, he carried his experience quietly, as an example rather than a message. He found comfort in knowing that even in later years, growth remains possible. Not growth in the sense of accumulation or achievement, but growth in clarity, in relationship with oneself, in the capacity to remain awake within one's own life. This kind of growth felt deeply appropriate to this stage of living. He was no longer building towards something far in the future. He was tending to the present, ensuring that the days he lived were days he inhabited fully. That was the real gift of the change. Not improved outcomes, not visible results, but a renewed sense of alignment between who he was and how he lived. He had learned that awareness does not demand sacrifice. It offers understanding. And understanding, when welcomed, brings peace. As time moved forward, he continued his routines with a lighter grip. Familiarity no longer felt like confinement. It felt like choice. Each day carried a quiet affirmation. I know why I do what I do. That knowing was enough. In the end, cutting back on salt had clarified something far more important than taste or habit. It had reminded him that life, even in its later chapters, remains responsive to attention. That dignity grows when we stay present, and that peace does not come from avoiding reflection but from allowing it. He did not change everything. He did not need to. He had changed his posture within his life, and in that shift he found something deeply sustaining: awareness, and sometimes that is the most meaningful choice a person can make.